Assalamu alaikum. In this video, we will see a practical example of using a NodePort service in Kubernetes to map a port of our worker node to the port of the pod where our application is running, which enable us to access our application, for example, from the browser. Here we have a YAML file for creating an nginx pod. We will use this file to deploy an nginx pod in the Kubernetes cluster, and then we will see how to create an NodePort service for mapping a port from the worker node to the port of the pod. Okay, here by default, the nginx pod will listen on the port 80. If you want to use another port, simply you have to define here in the ports array, and then give the container port the port that you want to use. For example, if you want to use the port 81, simply here give the container port the value 81. This port will be the target port for our NodePort service. For me, I will use the default port, which is the port 80. So let's remove that. Now let's create the YAML file that we will use to create the NodePort service. So here I will add a YAML file. I will call it nginx srv for service.yaml. Here we start with the API version, which is v1. Then kind. So here we are creating a service. And then for the metadata, I will give a name to our service. I'm gonna call it nginx srv. And finally, we have the spec section. Here, first of all, in the spec section, we have to define the type of the service that we are creating. So here we want to create a NodePort service. So the type will be NodePort. Then we have to define the ports that we need for a NodePort service. So we have the target port, which will be 80. Then we have port, which is at the port of the NodePort service. I will use the same port as the target port, which is 80. And finally, we will specify the node port, which is the port on the node that we want to map to the target port. For the node port, it should be between 30,000 and 32,267. So for example, we can use the port 30,001. And finally, we have to tell the NodePort service about the pods that should receive the traffic coming to our worker node on this pod. And that's done using labels and selectors. So here we have to add the selector section. And here we have to mention the same labels that we use for our nginx pod. So let's copy these two labels and paste them here in the selector section. Now, any request coming to our worker node on the port 30,001 will be forwarded by the NodePort service to the pods having these labels. Now let's create, first of all, our nginx pod using kubectl create -f nginx-pod.yaml. Here our nginx pod was created. Let's verify that using kubectl get pods. So here we have only one pod called nginx pod, and it is in the running state. And now we're gonna use this configuration file to create our NodePort service. So kubectl create -f nginx srv.yaml. Here we have an error because in the metadata instead of E we have A. So let's try to create our NodePort service again. Here we see that the nginx SRV was created successfully. So let's verify that using kubectl get services. Here we have two services, a cluster IP service, which is created when we start our Kubernetes cluster, and a NodePort service created 28 seconds ago using this YAML file. Now to access the nginx app, for example, from the browser, we need the node IP and the node port. So to get the node IP, we will first of all display the nodes that we have in our Kubernetes cluster using kubectl get nodes. Here I have only Minikube because I am using Kubernetes locally on my system. If you have many worker nodes in your Kubernetes cluster, you will see all of them here. This command didn't give us the IP of the worker nodes. So to get more information about the worker nodes, we can use kubectl get nodes with the wide option. So now we get more information about our worker nodes. And here is the node IP that we need to access our application from the browser. So let's copy this IP address. Now let's go to the browser. So here we combine the node IP with the node port, which is 30,001. And now we get the default view of our nginx app running inside the Kubernetes cluster. If we delete the NodePort service, we can't access the nginx app again. So let's delete the NodePort service and then check if we can access the application again. To delete the service, we use the command kubectl delete service, and then we give it the name of the service, which is nginx SRV in our case. So here we see that the nginx service was deleted. Now let's refresh this page. Now we get an error because we didn't have any port on the worker node mapped to the port of the pod. So if we want to access the application again, we have to recreate the node port service. We can use a single YAML file for creating multiple Kubernetes objects like a pod and a NodePort service. So for example, we can take this configuration of the NodePort service and put it here after the configuration needed to create the nginx pod. So now in the nginx pod.yaml, at the beginning we have the configuration needed to create an nginx pod, and then we have the configuration needed to create an NodePort service. So let's delete the nginx pod and then recreate it with the NodePort service using only this YAML file. So to delete the nginx pod, we use kubectl delete pod nginx pod. So the pod was deleted. We can verify that using kubectl get pods. So now we didn't have any pod in the cluster. Now let's create the nginx pod and the NodePort service using the nginx pod.yaml. So for that, we execute the command kubectl create, and then we give it the name of the YAML file, which is nginx pod.yaml. Now we see here that we have two Kubernetes objects created. We have created a pod, which is called nginx pod, and a service called nginx SRV. So if we list the pods that we have in the cluster, we have one pod called nginx pod, and if we display the services, so we have a NodePort service called nginx SRV. Now, because we have both the nginx pod running the nginx app and the node port mapping at the port 30,001 on the worker node to the port 80 of the pod, we can access the application again. So if we go to the browser and refresh this page, we get this view from our nginx app. The last thing that I want to mention here is that this node port is optional. So if we didn't set the node port when we create the node port service, Kubernetes will allocate for us a free port on the worker node, which will be between 30,000 and 32,267. So if we delete both the pod and the node port service using kubectl delete pod nginx pod. So here we are deleting the nginx pod, and then we delete the service using kubectl delete service nginx srv. Now let's recreate them using this YAML file and verify that Kubernetes will choose for us the node port, which will be between 30,000 and 32,267. To create the pod and the node port service, we use again the kubectl create, and we give it the name of the YAML file, which is nginxpod.yaml. So here we create two Kubernetes objects, which are the nginx pod and the nginx srv. If we display the services, so kubectl get services, here we have the nginx srv, which is an output service, and here we see the port chosen by Kubernetes and mapped to the port 80 on the pod. So now to access our application, we'll use the node IP with this pod. So let's take this pod. First of all, if we refresh here, we cannot access the application because the port that we are using now is not the port 30,001. So we have to change this port to the port 31,765. And now the application is accessible again. So that's an example of using the NodePort service in practical, and thank you very much.